So what I would like to do for the next few days is just show some brief content for you about different segments of our course. I'm going to make a few different shorter podcasts. This all is going to coordinate with a document set that I have, not a document set, a note sheet that you can follow along with. And it's following my lecture notes. And so you can populate the information as you go. All right, so it's going to be broken up into sort of a general interwar period conversation, particularly talking about the Great Depression. And then we're going to look at two countries in particular, the rise of Mussolini in Italy, sort of following the same exact time period, and then the rise of Hitler in Germany. From there, we're going to start World War II, and we'll do that very briefly, unfortunately, and then we'll go into the Cold War and modern politics in Europe. I'm hoping that this is providing some really good background for you, and it's of value for you for interest. I'm currently staying pretty deep still with information and details, and we can check in later once we meet again to talk about the level of detail. Nevertheless, the next three podcasts are all going to be focusing on this interwar period, this time frame that we tend to mark from 1918, the end of World War I, until 1939, the start of World War II. Now, there's a few different phases of the interwar period. There's a period from 1918 to 1923 that is a dramatic search for security. They're just transitioning from the Treaty of Versailles. There's a lot of concerns about what's going on at the time, and a lot of instability. There's still, in the Soviet Union, there's still the Civil War going on, and European powers, Western powers, are still getting involved in there. Poland is starting to fight for its own boundaries. There's quite a few violent wars there. Much of Eastern Europe actually is still in a state of war, even after World War I is over. Ireland during this time is in the middle of its civil war and its war against England for its independence. And so there's just lots of continuous conflict. So it's not really until 1923 that you can really see that the dust sort of settles throughout Europe, and we see this new time of growth and actually a willingness to try and create a lasting peace. Up until 1923, the countries are still having those hard feelings. But actually after 1923, even countries like France are considering, should we revise the Treaty of Versailles? So really different conversations are being held at that time. And so we identify that as the hopeful years, really from 1924 to 1929. Very positive. We'll look at a bunch of different peace treaties that are there and initiatives to really try and keep the peace. But then, of course, in 1929, we have the Great Depression. And with a huge economic crisis such as that, you see people really start to pull in and withdraw from the European or internationalism ideology, and instead really become much more nationalist, turning within, trying to protect their own country first, rather than looking at the needs of the world as a whole. And with that, the Great Depression is a major linchpin, right, where it really sees the shift from more international policies to trying to build up those walls, try and build up those barriers to protect your own country and serve that country's needs. And it's in that environment of the Great Depression that we see Hitler coming into power by 1933. And then from once Hitler comes into power in 1933 to 1939, we see efforts to avoid war, period of appeasement, without really any success, right? We see this effort to avoid. All right, so now they have a little overview there of sort of these different phases leading us into World War II. Where I want us to begin is talking once again about the search for security. The Treaty of Versailles left no one really satisfied, right? Every country, as we discussed, was unhappy. In particular, France felt very insecure after the Treaty of Versailles. Without the United States being part of the League, and it didn't join any alliance with France, even after that, France has no friends. It has no strong ally to protect itself against still a pretty strong, large country on its border. Germany is still in its eyes being a threat. And so it starts to build up its arms rather than following a policy of disarmament. France is building up and investing in a lot of arms. They also reach out to the east, these new Eastern European countries on the border of Germany, between the Soviet Union and Germany, and try to set up a network of alliances in Eastern Europe. Because after losing Russia to becoming the Soviet Union, France is really truly feeling left out on its own. France also feels that in order to protect itself, it needs to strictly enforce the Treaty of Versailles. And so one big way that they do this is they demand that Germany pays its reparations, and when they miss a payment or when they're falling behind, they start to really send in their own troops and military there. And so in that, particularly in that Rhineland area, right, in the border between France and Germany, that demilitarized zone, France is going to occupy its troops there, expecting Germany to pay. And so when Germany couldn't pay, they're going to be occupying not only the Rhine area, but into the Ruhr, which is the heart of the industrial center for Germany. And Germany is going to respond with what we call passive resistance. So instead of pushing against France or fighting, they do a work slowdown. So the workers who are going into work those areas work much slower. And the German government is just going to print tons and tons of money to make the money that they're paying France undervalued, and it leads to hyperinflation. I'm going to be posting along with this podcast a really, really fascinating excerpt from a reading on hyperinflation. It is great. It's so fascinating to read. I can't emphasize more. Please read it. We will discuss it once we all come, once we have our next class time, in-person class time. And so Germany, in response to all of this, is printing money. That's another format, and workers are just refusing to work. This is collapsing the Germans' economy, and not just France's, right? It's hurting both sides. It's getting France angry and upset, but also for the German economy, they are totally just destroying their own economy in order to resist against France and this resentment. And it really comes to a peak in 1923. So I just want to spend a moment just to look at this chart. It's shocking, right? So what this is showing is in paper marks, what you could exchange a paper mark for, what its value would be in one gold mark. So one to one. And in 1918, one gold mark equaled one paper mark. By 1923, one gold mark was the equivalent of a trillion, right? Did I do that right? Million, billion, trillion. Yeah, a trillion paper marks. Absurd, right? Absolutely absurd. This is an extraordinary time where the money just becomes completely devalued. Just some things about how daily life was functioning there. Let me just check. Yeah. Okay. So a few different details about how life worked at this time. You would get paid every day at noon, and every day you were getting paid a different amount. And so there's stories, and I believe this is in that reading, stories of teachers running across the schoolyard to give the money to someone else outside, so that way that person can buy whatever they can at that moment. Right. In addition to that, you have examples of times where menu prices, right? No one bothered printing menus anymore with prices on them, because as you're sitting at the meal, the price will change. So someone who got one cup of coffee, the second cup of coffee would cost more. It's just absurd. As you're seeing in these pictures, right? Just dollar bills being really worth nothing. So there's just strewn on the street, just so we would find pennies on the sidewalk today. Or here, a kid is making a kite out of the marks. Or more shocking still, I think, is this one, where it's cheaper to burn the money than to actually buy fuel with that said mark, with those said marks. And so this was a true economic crisis, and it challenges the culture and what people were being taught to believe and think in Germany at this time. Because Germany was a country that was teaching, to save, to invest your money, to hold on to it and to invest in a future. But what kind of future would you have when your money's worth nothing today? And so people's bank accounts were completely wiped out. The middle class in particular gets squashed through this hyperinflation. They lose everything. This is actually, it's called the vampire mark. You have to do a little research on this on your own. Supposedly,
This is a Dürer sketching, right? This is Dürer, very famous etch artist, the person who made this Deutschmark. And this is for a $10,000 mark. Supposedly, and I can't see it well on the screen, I'm not sure if you can, there's like a vampire or a bat sucking the blood from the neck of this person. And so this is an example, this vampire mark of the idea that the French people are sucking the blood out of the Germans and torturing them by demanding these things. It was a political statement embedded into the mark. So look up the vampire mark and see if you can see anything about it. I'll post some links if I can see anything myself. Past classes were able to see it, so I'm trying to see where it is now. So at this time, we're in this period of crisis. Sorry, my slides keep moving on me. There we go. We're going to see this real instability, and just as a note about the instability, during this time, during hyperinflation, communists are going to be gaining a lot of support in Germany along with other countries. And the economic problems are really just increasing the rich and poor divide. The wealthy have gotten even wealthier because of all the sales during the war. And then they invest in other safer investments. So we just see this big shift, and it makes the threat of communism all the more prevalent, particularly in a country like Germany that was close to the Soviet Union, being able to be under its influence. By 1924, really by the end of 1923, so at the same time that we have this crisis moment reaching its apex, we're also going to be at a time where we're recognizing that changes need to happen. And pretty much across all of Europe, we see new political leaders coming into power by 1924. England and France have governments that are much more conciliatory to Germany, and Germany elects people into power that are much more willing to carry out the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And so between these two movements, along with the United States recognizing that they're not getting back any of the loans that they made or making any money as long as Europe is still in crisis, by 1924 it's sort of like there's a breather. And we see this hopeful years period where we see some different changes. And one of the big ones is the Dawes Plan. So in the Dawes Plan, it was an American plan that came in to help settle these different disputes across Europe. And what it did is it reduced the amount of reparations Germany had to pay in one time. So Germany was going to use increased tax revenues to pay reparations to France rather than a set amount of money every single year. So it sort of slows off the payments. They're based on the ability Germany had to pay rather than expecting them to pay whether or not they could afford it. The United States also is going to be lending money to Germany, which has then helped build the German economy post-World War I. This is significant for a few different reasons. Yes, it calms down the tensions in a lot of ways, but it's also really a sign of the new position the United States plays in European affairs and in global affairs. This really shows the United States is entering to be the balance of power in all of the world, right? Sort of shifting the balance of power to what was once always a conversation of the continental Europe. Now we have this new balance, the United States, who's able to use money and investments and negotiation and sort of to be this power that can negotiate disputes significantly in Europe, playing a really big role. At first, this seems very promising, and then in 1925, we actually pass another treaty, which is really another very promising push for peace. It's called the Treaty of Locarno. And the Treaty of Locarno it guaranteed that Germany's western borders with France and Belgium would be where they are now. So that way, Germany was not feeling threatened by any kind of potential for France to invade Germany in any way. It was viewed as a new era of peace, a new chance, right? Where in this Locarno, we've established our borders, we've agreed to them, and as you can see, this cartoon here, it's 1,000 years of European bloodshed, and you see Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, France, Germany, finally making it over the hill. We've recognized our boundaries, we recognize our borders, and we can gaze towards peace. And so it was a very promising, hopeful time. And by 1926, just 1 year after that, Germany is able to join the League of Nations. There's also the Kellogg-Briand Act pact that's passed, where 63 nations eventually agree to renounce war as any kind of instrument of a national policy. So it would never be a policy of war, is not a sense of national identity or strength or a way of gaining new land, renouncing war altogether. The challenge with all of these treaties, the Locarno Treaty, the Dawes Plan, Dawes Plan wasn't really a treaty, but Locarno and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in either case, there was no statement of what would happen if someone ignored this treaty. So what if France decided to not recognize the border of West Germany anymore? Or what if a country did decide to use war as a national policy? There was no consequence, and there was no agreement among the other European powers in that League of Nations to step in any way to enforce these things. League was still very, very weak, and the United States, although happy to help see these treaties come to be, wasn't stepping in to really do what they had to do to intervene. And so there's a weakness here that's going to become really obvious by about 1936. By 1926, very hopeful, things look good, right? Pretty much in all of Western Europe, we're seeing a bit of a roaring 20s. There's the same experience in the United States. Definitely not as wealthy, but a loosening of morals, a sense of internationalism, a sense of celebration throughout Europe. And then the Great Depression hits. So in terms of causes for the Great Depression, so the Great Depression, it was caused by weaknesses in international trade and monetary theories and practices. And in the long term, what it did, it undermined Western European democracies, fomenting radical political responses throughout all of Europe. World War I debt is going to be a big reason why we start to see the Great Depression hit so hard in Europe. The debt tied Europe to the United States. So as we start to see the United States stock market crash, it directly impacts what's happening in Europe. They were so dependent upon those loans, along with the different trade patterns that they were used to. In addition to that, there were other risks for Europe. One big one was agricultural commodities being overproduced. During World War I, Europe was not growing any food for themselves. And so post-World War I, by about 1927, they're finally able to recover pre-war farm production. But Argentina, the United States, Canada, Australia, countries that had been supplying Europe food during the war itself, had maintained war-level production. So by 1927, there's this crisis point where Europe and the United States and everywhere, the agricultural commodities drop, and no one's valuing that anymore. So that's going to cause quite a bit of trouble. There's also that dependence on North American investments in Europe, and particularly American capital. And so when the stock market crashes in the United States is cutting off any kind of capital flows to Europe. And that's going to cause other investors to panic. And they're pulling money, particularly from Germany. So that Dawes Plan cycle of Germany getting money from the United States to be able to pay off their debts to France, so France can pay its debts to the United States, just ends, right? The flow of money collapses. And we're looking today, right, at the high spike of unemployment rates and the response of the Federal Reserve making money easily available for banks, so that way the flow of money can continue, right? That's what's important, is that people can get the money where they need it to go. So throughout all of Europe, we're seeing banks closing and the economy is weakened. The effects of this, the unemployment is enormous. A quarter of the British population is unemployed, and 40% of Germans are unemployed. 40%. Women end up having to work. Many times in a family dynamic, women are able to find a job because they're the low-paying wage salary. So women get a low-paying job while their husbands are unemployed, which is also a hit to morale. Right? These are oftentimes veterans of World War I who wanted to return to a traditional family setup. Meanwhile, now the wife is working, the husband is not, and it's bringing even greater shame upon people. And so disgruntled husbands become more open to radical political ideas. And so when we look at people like Mussolini and his gathering of the black shirts, part of that is this sentiment of inadequacy, trying to fulfill. Young unemployed men in particular is a huge glut of the population. Those are the ones who really lose their jobs and are struggling the most. And they're going to be joining different gangs, walking around the streets. They have nothing else to do. Governments are also really challenged during this time and viewed as ineffective. Despite attempts to rethink economic theories and policies, Western democracies fail to overcome the Great Depression, and they're weakened by extremist movements trying to push otherwise. And so we see simplistic dictatorial solutions becoming really popular. Simple solutions for complex problems sound attractive, sound good, and like a positive opportunity for places. And so the democracies themselves are not able to fulfill this. Greater challenge too, the Soviet Union is successfully implementing those 5-year plans at the same time that these economies are collapsing. So communist parties are also gaining popular support. There's demand for more radical ideas. No one's sure what the right answer will be, but there is a call for some kind of change. So we're going to look specifically at a few different countries and how they respond to the Great Depression. So one is in England, Great Britain, the Labour Party. Labour Party is in power in 1924 for 10 months, and then they come again into power from 1928 to 1931. The Labour Party during both of these times is supporting the trade unions. They want government intervention into the economy. They say the solution for the problems of the economy, for growth, for development, would be nationalization of key industries. When in power, the Labour Party tries to nationalize industries but isn't able to fully implement it, and as a result they don't really take any kind of vigorous action and particularly during the Depression. The Labour Party doesn't respond. That's their failure to respond. So the Conservative Party then comes into power in 1931, and they're now supported more. This is a shift since World War I. The Conservatives are now more supported by the middle class and the aristocrats together, and they're favoring more laissez-faire policies. The Great Depression itself creates a crisis point where the two parties end up making a national government, quote-unquote national government, a coalition government. The conservatives, liberals, and the right-wing Labour Party, because they're being threatened by a rise of a larger communist party in their midst. So this new coalition government that really comes into its own by 1931 is going to be using protective tariffs, high protective tariffs, stopping really any kind of international trade, not allowing any foreign goods coming into their country, trying to really protect, buy Great Britain, protect British industries. They also stop paying any war debts to the United States during this time, and they go off the gold standard. Despite all of these efforts, unemployment remains extraordinarily high in Great Britain. It wasn't working. Now, while that is going on, during this crisis, there's a man named John Maynard Keynes who starts to propose a different approach to this crisis, and it's called Keynesian economics. And this is the policy that we're familiar with in the United States in response to economic crises. And what Keynesianism is in Britain, it's a new economic theory that was never applied in England at this time. So I'm introducing it here because it's influential for European history as well as Western history, Western Civ, but it's not a part of the Great Britain solution to the Depression. In Keynesian economics, it's believed that the government should intervene in the economy during a depression. And depressions are created and caused by a lack of demand, not because of overproduction. So the theory was always, there's an overproduction of goods. Let's put up our protective tariffs. Let's not allow outside goods to come in. People will buy those things then. And Keynes is saying, no, it's not. We shouldn't look on the end of overproduction. Instead, we should say we need a market for our goods. We need people to be purchasing. So we need to increase spending. And that's his solution. We need to increase spending in order to stimulate the economy. We need to create a demand that's not there. And so the government needs to do whatever it takes to start creating a demand. That could be as simple as the government just buying stuff. Just throwing it away, but buying stuff, just throwing money at things, purchasing things, so that way people get that money in their pockets and they too then can buy. And we need to do stimulus packages, right? Different kinds of approaches. Keynes's theory is really challenging the traditional liberal approach to fixing economic issues. there's no past suggestion of this. The idea of having a balanced budget gets thrown out the window with Keynesian economics. And the idea of protectionist tariffs, which has been a tradition since mercantilism periods, is now being challenged too as worthless, as not worthwhile as an endeavor. There were other solutions to the Great Depression, and I think the one I would think is most interesting is what happened in Scandinavia. Scandinavia was primarily an agricultural region at this time, and they also approached the Great Depression with a new economic theory, and it's called cooperative social action. And cooperative social actions are still alive and well in a lot of co-ops today. Particularly a lot of dairy farmers use co-ops today, where you own your individual private farm, but then collectively you co-own a company, a business, or a way to process it. So a lot of dairy farmers will have their own cows, but they might go someplace for the cows to be milked in a mechanized format, and they might have a place that they collectively pasteurize their milk and label it and sell it and distribute it. So they're sharing the resources for marketing and for other promotions. How did Scandinavia do this on a national level? Well, what the government did is they made privately owned and operated cooperatives for their people. And they're avoiding the pitfalls of communism, the lack of incentive, as well as the problems with a purely capitalist system. Because individually as a farmer, if I work extra hard, I'm going to make more profit, but I also have a safety net of the community support around me. And so Scandinavia is one of the first countries to really set up a social democratic government, and that system was able to weather the Depression better than most. Now, a few caveats with this. Yes, they were able to weather the Depression better than most, but they were primarily agricultural. They're not really comparative to the United States, Great Britain, or France, right? It's the Scandinavian countries were in a different kind of economic status at this point in terms of their power and position. Now, the Great Depression in France. France in the 1920s never really recovered from World War I, and the bulk of the battles, the bulk of the fighting of World War I happened in the Western Front in France's territory. And so infrastructure in France was completely destroyed. France was not really prosperous in any way. And so when the Depression hits in France, it causes even more damage, right? It really is felt. And in 1932 is really when the Depression hits its peak in France. And that's going to be the same in Germany. It doesn't hit it exactly in 1929. It's going to happen over time. So this depression, it causes a lot of political chaos in France. Right-wing groups in France start to demonstrate in the streets. And there's riots in the streets promoting ideas like the fascism that we see in Italy and Germany. France was very, very close to also becoming a fascist state. Leftists then are going to pull together out of fear. All the different left parties, and I don't mean like far left, I'm saying like even moderate parties, they're all going to agree that we need to join together in order to avoid the rise of this right-wing extremist party. And so they create the Popular Front, or the Front Populaire, which are these two posters here. It's socialists and radical parties together. So Marxists are there, along with, when we use that word radical, we're not really talking about like extreme radicals. We're talking about small property owners. They're Republicans. I would say they're really more moderate, but they identify themselves as the radical party. In general, this group, they're anti-militarism, anti-clerical, pro-education, and those were what they stood for. And the Popular Front is able to eventually gain an election as a coalition government, similar to what happened in England, the formation of this coalition government to avoid extremes. And they come into power by 1936. And at that time, they set up a bunch of programs for workers, providing them paid vacations, allowing for the legalization of unions to be able to organize themselves, protect their workers' interests. They do a lot of good things for workers, but they're failing to really address the problems of the Depression. France is still, that's 1936, France is still in decline by 1939, and so they are unprepared for Germany altogether, completely unprepared. If we were in class right now, I'd be turning to Stephen and asking for his input to talk about the Maginot Line as another effort by the French government to sort of respond to the economic crisis and the threat of Germany in the 1930s. But France was just woefully unprepared for this war and really not ready for it. So that's where we'll stop today, and then tomorrow we'll focus on the rise of authoritarian and totalitarian rule. All right, take care.